All right, welcome everyone. In the interest of time, like I said, I'm going to try to keep the intros brief. The Federalist Society's goal is to promote open discussion and debate about the fundamental principles of freedom, federalism, separation of powers, and judicial restraint. I'm honored to introduce Glenn Loury, a Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. Professor Loury is a prominent social critic and public intellectual who has been addressing issues of racial inequality and social policy for just about 40 years. He also hosts the Glenn Show on Blogging Heads TV, which is a sanctuary from some of the less stimulating conversations around social issues affecting our country today. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to Professor Glenn Loury.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kyle. I'm pleased to be with you. I have some remarks prepared. I see that people are still ringing on, but I think I should probably get started because we have a limited amount of time. I've given the title, What's Wrong with Critical Race Theory? So here we go. I believe we stand at a critical crossroads in our nation's history where clear thinking and direct speaking are imperative. Critical race theory is not of much use to us now. I wish to ask here, why is there such tension and conflict between the so-called Black community and the cops? Here are a few unspeakable truths about this. First of all, Blacks have a higher rate of contact with the police. That is, Blacks more frequently exhibit behavior that calls the attention of the police. Secondly, it's not only coming into contact with the police, it's also resisting the police. That is, a person's behavior conditional on having contact with the police is critical. If you comply with the police directives, you won't get killed. If you do not run, you won't be chased. If you do not resist arrest, you won't have to be restrained. Why isn't this simple truth being trumpeted on a daily basis and throughout the country by every organ of public communication? I know the answer to that rhetorical question. It's because to do so would be to credit the legitimacy of police authority in such situations. One of the objectives of critical race theory is to undermine our casual embrace of that legitimacy. But why would anyone be reluctant to credit the legitimacy of the cops? That's a very important question to ponder. For my part, I want to claim right here, right now, that this whole conversation is fake at a deep level. We're not coming to terms with the root causes of what's going on, which is routinely ascribed to something called systemic racism, but which in fact is the vastly disproportionate overrepresentation of African Americans amongst lawbreakers, especially violent criminals, and the mindlessly irresponsible mistake of leading people to think that it's a political act of resistance when, in the circumstances that they encounter the police, they resist the police directives. You cannot do that without consequence. If it needs to be saying here, of course, most Blacks are not lawbreakers. That's not what I'm saying. But then most Blacks will never end up in a life-threatening encounter with the police. So I want to ask the obvious question. Why is this whole discussion so fake? First of all, the media abet the fake treatment of this issue and flourish in the context of it. Secondly, demagogues have a financial and a political interest in fostering it. Demagogues like Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who traveled from Washington, D.C. to Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, in order to inspire crowds to resist, confront, resist, because if a certain police officer is not convicted of murder, we're going to be mad as hell and we're going to burn this down. No, of course, that's not a quote, but that's what she was doing, a member of Congress. Suppose a Republican pro Trump person in the context of a disputed election had done something similar. I think we know what the narrative would be. And yet I'm unable to find any commentary anywhere in the press except right wing sources critical of Maxine Waters' demagogic incitement. Instead, national reporters for public broadcasting pester the Biden administration, demanding that it defend Waters against conservative criticisms of her incitement. We are in deep trouble here, and critical race theory is of no use whatsoever. We have not seen the last of it. This problem, blacks and the cops, is far from being resolved. Mobs around courthouses are a catastrophe for our democracy and an affront to all of our rights, including Derek Chauvin's. Mobs around courthouses demanding that defendants be convicted irrespective of the evidence, because we all saw a certain video, are obviously contemptible and deserve to be denounced. And yet, who among us is denouncing these mobs? Tucker Carlson? Who else? The fact of the matter is that a former president of the United States, I speak of Barack Hussein Obama, refuses to say the simple words, "Let justice prevail here. It's the jury's call, and we must respect whatever decision they arrive at." Refuses to say, "Don't resist the cops and you won't end up in a violent confrontation with them." Instead says, "We have to rethink policing from the ground up at this important historical moment of reckoning." And the sitting president of the United States insults all of us by using virtue signaling slogans like systemic racism as if he just emerged from a Black Studies seminar room. Here is the staggering consequence of all of this: that the aberrant behavior by a relative few miscreants who resist being arrested in fraught circumstances of their own making and find themselves in trouble with the police. This problematic behavior has been enabled to cause our great country to descend into riotous and arsonist mayhem, the threat of which precludes the possibility of the actual doing of justice. Organs of responsible journalism refuse to say a simple truth, that the cops are doing an impossible job and that they are mainly, not always, but mostly in the right. Obviously, they're not perfect, but they're also not the core of the problem here. Am I the only one who sees this? This is not only an intellectual cul-de-sac that we've wandered into here, or a mistaken ethical or moral analysis by a few newspaper editors. This is political disaster. We're flirting with catastrophe here. And it needs to be opposed not just by people like me, gadfly Black conservatives, who have essentially zero influence, but by the people who command the heights of the American public's attention in politics and the press and the academy, in arts and entertainment. The narrative here, the critical race theoretic narrative, is completely wrong. I'm going to repeat myself. Criminality, violent criminality, and Blacks' vast overrepresentation amongst those committing violent criminal offenses lies at the root of this issue. Now, we could go into why that is, but darn it, the cops didn't cause it. You want to talk about the family? You want to talk about values? You want to talk about hip hop culture? You want to talk about a mentality of victimization where everything is interpreted through the 400-year-old lens of our ancestors' enslavement? How about the lack of responsibility in a community that can leave a 13-year-old walking around on the streets of Chicago at 2 a.m. with a pistol? The cops did not cause that. To the extent that this is a racial issue at all, the root of this problem lies in the failure of social development for so many Black people, obviously not all, which reflects monumental deficiencies in some parts of this culture. among other causes. Cops didn't do that either, and neither did white supremacy. The stakes here couldn't be higher for Black people and for the country as a whole. As you know, there's been an upsurge in violent crime in urban communities across the country, even as this reckoning with America's racism has been unfolding. How many unarmed Black people are killed by the cops in a year? A dozen, 2 dozen at most. You've got 8,000 homicides with Black victims in this country in a given year. There are areas of American society that are absolutely unlivable because of the depredations of carjackers, gangbangers, robbers, muggers, and rapists. Because of teenagers carrying guns in the middle of the street at 1 a.m., terrorizing people. But in the preferred narrative of critical race theory, the cops have become the enemy. And what I can only see as cartoonish misrepresentations, cops as stormtroopers, over-militarized villains, racist hordes preying upon people. This is not just a caricature, it's a complete lie. How would this change? If serious people, like the former president of the United States and the first Black person who had been elected to that office, or the current sitting vice president of the United States and the first Black person who had been elected to that office, were to use their enormous influence on behalf of the country in the face of this madness, then perhaps something could change. We're editors of major organs, and it does not require that all of them, but a few, leading magazines, websites, and newspapers, at foundations that anoint iconic cultural figures, were these people to broaden their perspective. They don't have to become conservatives. They simply have to get beyond the virtue signaling and bandwagon jumping that characterizes their behavior so as to actually engage with all of the nuance of this problem. We might be able to get somewhere. Black Lives Matter goes the chant. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. 8,000 Black homicides in a year, and this goes unmentioned in the context of evoking the value of Black life. They're going to call me an Uncle Tom sellout for speaking in this way. They can call me whatever they want. I don't care. It's time to tell the truth as best we can understand it. That's what I'm getting paid for. That's what the great privilege of having a microphone and a podium requires of me. If someone thinks I'm wrong, let them prove me wrong. We can argue, but calling me names doesn't faze me. This is my bottom line. Basically, we Americans have achieved equality of opportunity in our country in terms of race, basically. We've chased away the Jim Crow bugaboos. We have not only put laws on the books, but we have adopted widespread social customs and practices and norms that have moved us so far away from 1960 that it is not even funny. Democrats are reduced to calling the Georgia voter integrity law a resurgence of racism because basically there is no Jim Crow. It's supposed to be the new Jim Crow. There is no Jim Crow anywhere in this country. All of this is banner waving and slogan spouting. It does not touch the ground in terms of anything real. It's manipulative. It's lies. Throwing around these words in this way, as George Orwell chronicled so well in his essay, Politics and the English Language, renders the words meaningless. They become slogans, banners. They mean nothing whatsoever. All of this is very bad for our country and very bad for the future of Black people. Here we are now, a fifth of the way into the 21st century. The world is so fast moving, it's not even funny. Have you heard of China? Do people know what's going on in the world as they play these little games? The world is being remade every decade by technology, by globalization, by communication, by innovation. Here is the truth of the matter. The reason why the race discussion and the shibboleth called critical race theory have become so hysterical is that we Black people with full citizenship and freedom, with every opportunity in the richest country, the most dynamic society on the planet, a society which attracts the attention and the envy of people globally who want to be a part of it. We Blacks have birthright citizenship here, and we are failing to measure up. The cops and crime and violence is one dimension of it. The absolute disorder and chaos in our family lives is another dimension of it. The failure to develop our intellectual potential and to perform and function effectively in venues of intellectual competition is another dimension of it. We have no place to hide from the future. It's coming willy-nilly, and affirmative action won't save us from it. So, all some of us can do at this juncture is to go into a corner and throw a tantrum. Moreover, and sadly, our leaders, including the former President Barack Hussein Obama, are at the forefront of this disastrous course. The people who might actually alter the course lack the courage, the wisdom, and the fortitude to do so. Fecklessly, they jump on bandwagons, they sloganeer, and they virtue signal. They play games while people who are going to pay the cost of this are the Black poor, the ones who can't read, the ones who languish now in a jail somewhere because of their own behavior. I'm absolutely furious with these people, the leaders, their irresponsibility, their demagoguery, their cowardice. I'm furious with them because they are leading us to hell. We're on the road to hell here. I will offer a final illustration of this disastrous political practice in which progressive leaders who embrace critical race theory and who seek after something that they call racial justice are engaged. Why would they racialize a crime discussion in America when Blacks are so vastly overrepresented amongst the criminals? Not all Blacks, if I have to say it again. But when you're a tenth of the population and half of the homicides, why would you do that? Do you really think you can talk only about white cops and not about Black criminals? You can't. It may be true about the editorial pages of the New York Times. They may be telling us that looting is as American as apple pie, but in the real America, people are not fools. They can see what's going on. More generally, I suspect that what we're seeing with the progressives in the academy and the media, the critical race theory mongers, is but one side of the whiteness card. They like to talk about whiteness. They like to dump on whiteness. But I wonder if the white guilt and white apologia and white privilege view of the world cannot exist except also to give birth to a backlash of white pride, even if the latter is seldom expressed overtly, it being politically incorrect to do so. Confronted by someone who is constantly bludgeoning me about the evils of colonialism, urging me to tear down the statues of dead white men, insisting that I apologize for what my forebears are said to have done to peoples of color in years past, demanding that I settle my historical indebtedness to them via reparations and so forth. Confronted by such a person, were I a white oppressor, I well might begin to ask myself, exactly on what foundations does human civilization in the 21st century stand? I might begin to enumerate the great works of philosophy, mathematics, and science that ushered in the Age of Enlightenment, that allowed modern medicine to exist, that gave rise to the core of human knowledge about the origins of the species or the origins of the universe. I might begin to tick off the great artistic achievements of European culture, the architectural innovations, the paintings, the symphonies, and so forth. And then were I in a particularly agitated mood, I might even ask these people of color who think that they can simply bully me into a state of guilt-ridden self-loathing, where is their civilization? Mind you now, everything I just said exemplifies racist and white supremacist rhetoric. I wish to stipulate, should it be necessary, that I personally, Glenn Loury, would never actually say something like that. I'm not here attempting to justify that position. I'm simply noticing that if I were a white person, it might tempt me. And I cannot help but think that it is tempting a great many. You can wag your fingers at them all you want, but they are a part of the racism mongers package. If one is going to go down the road of making whiteness into a site of unrelenting moral indictment, which is what critical race theory does, you cannot expect but that you will also occasion it to be the basis of pride, of identity, and ultimately of self-affirmation. I risk being canceled for this, but I'll say it anyway. There's only one right idea here. It's the idea of Gandhi and Martin Luther King in his prime, that we should transcend racial particularism while stressing the universality of our humanity. That is the right idea. If only fitfully and by degrees, to carry on the march toward race blindness. They laugh at you when you say this now, but it's the only way. To move toward a world where no person's worth is contingent upon racial inheritance. It's the only way to address a legacy of racism historically, to be effective in doing so without running into reactionary chauvinism. Promoting anti-whiteness, which is what Black Lives Matter does. Can we even acknowledge that? It might cause you to reap what you sow, I say to my fellow Black people, in a backlash of pro-whiteness. This is yet another unspeakable truth, which as a responsible Black intellectual, it's my duty to apprise you of. What is more, there's a deep irony in first declaring, as the critical race theorists do, that white America is systemically racist, but then mounting a campaign to demand that whites recognize their own racism, become allies, and deliver Black people from its consequences. I want to say to such people who advocate that policy, if indeed you were right in the first place that our oppressors are racist, why would you expect them to respond to a moral appeal? You are in effect putting yourself on the mercy of a court while simultaneously decrying that the court is unrelentingly biased. That's your politics? The logic escapes me. So I'll conclude. My final unspeakable truth, I utter it now in defiance of cancel culture because I'm way past that. If we Black Americans want to walk with dignity, if we want to be truly equal, if we want true equality, we have to realize that white justice DAs can't give it to us. White university presidents and admissions councils cannot provide it for us. The government can't make us equal. We have to actually earn equal status through our deeds or through the reduction of our misdeeds. Now, you can get mad at me if you want to. I'm on the side of Black people here, but it's my duty to report that something called dignity, honor, security in one's position in society, equality in its fullest sense, equality of commanding the respect of others, these are not things that can be handed over. These are things that one has to wrest from a cruel and indifferent world with hard work, with our bare hands. Inspired by the example of our enslaved and newly freed ancestors, we have to make ourselves equal. No one can do it for us. I realize that there are not many Black people in the audience to which I have just delivered this address. I want you to know that I deliver the same kind of address everywhere I go, regardless of the composition of the audience, because it's what I think is true. So I invite your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Loury. While we start Q&A, I promised professors that I would offer their questions to you first. Everyone else is welcome to use the raise hand feature as I allow that to queue up for questions. Or you could type your questions to me to be read anonymously. Please keep questions succinct And if a question becomes a sermon, I'm gonna have to interrupt you out of respect for the other participants. All right, the first question, I might know the answer to this one already, but recently the College of Law had for a common read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. If you have any familiarity with Professor Kendi's views, would you please comment on them?
Sure, I will. I'm not a big fan of Ibram Kendi. I've discussed this at my podcast. I have read the book. I'm not going to say I've read every word of every page of the book. I have a general idea of the nature of the argument there. Either you are a racist or you're an anti-racist. There's no in between. Racism insinuates itself everywhere. Disparities that we see, gaps or differences in wealth or in grades in a college or in occupational penetration or whatever it might be, are ipso facto evidence of racial unfairness. The government should be much more proactive in attempting to intervene to use its power of regulation to ensure racial disparity and, again, presumptively in regard to any ensure racial parity and presumptively respond to any observed disparity with some kind of remedy. I'm not a big fan of Ibram X. Kendi. I've declared my position. I threw down the gauntlet. Basically, there's shadowboxing with a phantom. Racial discrimination is not a first order or even a second order issue. The disparities that we're talking about when we say there are not enough blacks in Silicon Valley, when we say the Oscars are so white, when we say that Harvard doesn't have enough black undergraduates, or Georgetown Law is a racist institution because a professor is overheard commenting about the actual performance of students in their classroom. This is all made up phantom injustice. Development is the real issue here. Kendi doesn't reach it. He never gets to the issue of what Black people are going to do about enhancing our capacities to perform. In my view, that is the new frontier. That's the 21st century problem. The Jim Crow analogies are oh so early and mid 20th century. They're almost 2 generations out of date. The world is moving fast underneath our feet. Have you heard about immigration? I mean this with respect to the questioner. I don't mean any ridicule. Of course you've heard about immigration. Of course you've heard about what's going on around the world. Black kids are reading at the 12th grade, on average, at the level of white kids at the 8th grade in this country today. You can call that systemic racism if you want to. It gets you nowhere. Educational institutions are basically bending over backwards not to be systemically racist. Look at how the critical race theory ideology has penetrated them. So I think Ibram X. Kendi barks up the wrong tree. I think he hits a note that is, resonant in the current zeitgeist, but I am a curmudgeon here vis-a-vis the zeitgeist. I think people have got it wrong, badly, badly wrong. I think bias is not the problem. Development is the problem. Black people not being competitive in too many venues is the problem. I mean, you people are in law school right now. You know what contracts requires of you. You know what con law requires of you. You know what torts requires of you. You know what civil procedure requires. You know what parsing an opinion requires. You know what being able to make an argument means in terms of intellectual work. If blacks are at the bottom of the negotiation class taught by an adjunct at Georgetown Law School today, because of affirmative action, and the narrative becomes racist institution, Georgetown, let's find another few descendants of the slaves that the friars transacted 170 years ago and give them a scholarship. Such rhetoric is completely disconnected from reality. It's a bluff. Believe me, partners at white shoe law firms know the difference between crackerjack associates who can actually help them do the work and people who cluster at the bottom of their law school class. They know the difference. So I repeat, Ibram Kendi, if you want racial equality, get busy lifting the performative level of Black people in the most selective venues where our performance actually lags and where changing that performance could make a real difference. Everything else is being patted on the head. It's being patronized by gatekeepers who would much rather placate you as you throw your tantrum than they would confront the very serious problem of developing you so that you could perform. Why wouldn't the dean of the Georgetown University Law School respond to that brouhaha by saying, oh my God, what do we need to do to raise the performance of our Black students whom we will send into the world, knowing that they clustered near the bottom of their class, those of whom did. Not all of them, of course, who were Black did, but the majority of the ones at the bottom of the class were Black, the woman reports. Why wouldn't the response to that to be a slap on the forehead and a wondering of how the institution is failing its students, not looking at the navel and contemplating the white supremacist origins of the institution? It's a fraud. And so is Ibram X. Kendi, frankly, in my humble opinion. You asked me.
The next one is some of our law students will be exposed to the species of critical race theory known as critical legal studies for the first time while they are here in law school. What advice would you offer them that you think would be useful prior to this exposure?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Read Thomas Sowell. It's kind of a joke. He's a conservative economist, a very brilliant man. He's 90 years old. He happens to be an African American. He writes books about race and inequality. And his intellectual depth, his range, he studies societies all over the world in terms of race and inequality. His rigor, his rootedness in evidence runs rings and circles around the critical race theory. So get some alternative sources of input. He's an economist. That's an economist's outlook. His books don't have equations and heavy mathematical demands on the reader. He's more like a historical literary style. Read Thomas Sowell. That would be my advice. But frankly, I'm not a legal scholar, and I can't give you chapter and verse about what's in the law reviews that represents a counterpoint. I'm sure there's stuff there, but I don't know what it is.
Many colleges and universities are abandoning the use of standardized tests. Many law schools in particular are reviewing reliance on the LSATs. This trend seems to rest on racial disparities in the outcomes of those tests. Would you comment on this thread? This kind of goes to what you were talking about before.
It does, and that is happening. I'm not up on who's using and who's abandoned. I hear that with COVID, there was some suspension of temporary nature because the circumstances of taking the test might expose people, and that has been being rolled over into being more permanent in some institutions. Um, Now, I approach this as a statistician. I'm a trained economist, econometrician. I'm a fellow of the Econometric Society. So my first way of thinking about this is it's a prediction problem. Why are you using any criteria? Why don't you just select at random? People send in applications, you put them all in a bin and you pull them out. Well, presumably you have some idea that the criteria on the application give you information about the suitability of the student, suitability in terms of their intellectual and academic preparation, suitability in terms of how well they'll perform in the program after being admitted. A selective school, if you are selective, has objectives, and presumably the quote unquote best students, the highest performing students, the ones who will make the most use of the instruction on offer, are what they're aiming for. So they're trying to predict. So a first order question becomes whether or not any instrument of selection is actually predictive of post selection performance. If the LSAT is not, if it doesn't tell us anything useful in an information sense about how students will perform after the fact, then it shouldn't be used, period, regardless of its racial disparity. It shouldn't be used because it's not relevant to the objectives of selection. So I want to stipulate as a fact that the LSAT actually is correlated. Now, it's not perfectly correlated. It's, of course, a noisy predictor. But someone scoring in the top 10% of the test takers of the LSAT should be expected to do better in a rigorous program of legal education than someone scoring at the 50th percentile of the distribution of test takers on the LSAT. So if you give me that, let's say you give me that, the LSAT is predictive. Now, let's add to that the fact that it's disparate. That is, Blacks don't do so well. That is, maybe only 1 or 2% of the Black test takers are in the top 15% or 10% of all test takers. I don't know the actual numbers, but I would be not at all surprised if it was something like what I just said. Now the institution knows that if it employs the LSAT as a criterion of selection, it's going to screen out the vast majority of the Black applicants. It's going to end up with very few Blacks in its class, and that might be an unacceptable outcome. We're in the territory of affirmative action. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying you need things to predict how students are going to do. The LSAT is one of those things. If you use it, it's going to have a disparate incidence, and that's also undesirable. So now you have a trade-off. You know, you're going to maybe not use it as much, or maybe the resolution of that trade-off is to not use it at all. But let me just tell you that if that's where you end up, not using it at all, that's a policy that you have embraced for every matriculant at the law school, not just for the Blacks. You're not just suspending the LSAT for the underrepresented minority group, you're suspending it for everybody, which means you're changing the nature of your institution to court. It becomes an entirely different show because you could not bear the disparity. Now, I recall the late Justice Scalia saying from the bench in one of his acerbic commentaries of a consul during oral arguments, I think it was at the University of Michigan. I think what he said to the law school in the University of Michigan, these cases going back to the aughts, to like 2002, where Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a controlling opinion. He's saying to the University of Michigan's consul who are defending their affirmative action program, if you want to be diverse, why do you have to be so elite? This is a paraphrase of the late Justice Scalia. You can be diverse if you want to be, but then you don't have to be so elite. In other words, you don't have to engage in racial discrimination to be diverse. You can just stop being elite. Basically, he's inviting them to get rid of the LSAT when they select at the University of Michigan for students coming in. They be in compliance with the law as Scalia understands it because they'd not be engaged in racial discrimination. They simply wouldn't be as elite. He's got a point, and the point is not a political point. It's not an ideological point. It's not a legal doctrine point. It's a statistical point. You can get rid of the LSAT if you want to, if you just can't bear the reality of African Americans' relative lack of the acquisition of the intellectual skills well measured by the LSAT. If you can't bear the reality of that, you can get rid of it. But mind you, you're not just getting rid of a selection criterion, you're changing the character of your institution, and it's going to apply across the board. Gatekeepers haven't wanted to do that. That's why we have the affirmative action shell game that we have right now. Gatekeepers have wanted to remain elite and to be diverse. And that has led them to institutionalize the practice of assessing African American applications by different criteria than the ones they use to assess the applications of others. That's many things, but it is not equality.
Professor Cover, you can go ahead and ask your question. Should be able to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Professor Loury, thank you for visiting with us and thank you for your candor. I wanted to ask you about scholarship on field experiments with labor discrimination based on the name of the applicant. These are studies that take an identical resume and send it out to a lot of employers, but for sometimes they use white sounding names, sometimes they use an African-American sounding name, and they find that they get different outcomes in terms of the likelihood of callbacks just based on the name of the candidate. And I'm asking for your response for two reasons. One is you seem to be claiming with a high degree of confidence that bias plays no role in explaining racial disparities in the employment in employment or labor outcomes. And so I'd appreciate your take on that. But also, with President Obama, when we had our first African American president, there was a really sustained campaign to question his legitimacy and to question whether he was really an American citizen. And part of that was by focusing on the fact that his middle name was Hussein. And I've noted that throughout your talk, you've also referred to President Obama as Barack Hussein Obama. And in light of that literature, I wonder why you choose to refer to President Obama in that way.
Yeah, let me answer the second question first. That's his name. That's his name. His name is Barack Hussein Obama, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John Fitzgerald Kennedy,
Yeah, but
George
the
Herbert Walker
context is
Bush.
different, though. The context is different because he's the only president where many people who emphasize his middle name are asserting that he was not born in the United States, and there
So
are millions.
what you're
who
asking me to
think that.
do, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please complete your question.
You know, there are millions of Americans who think falsely, based on misinformation, that President Obama was not born in the United States because
I'm
of
not
his.
one of them. I'm not one of them, and I can use his name. I'm supposed to intentionally avoid his name so as not to give aid and comfort, imagined aid and comfort, to people who are racist and who believe that he's not a citizen of the United States. That's an odd way for me to conduct myself. I mean, what is that? That's not even virtue signaling. What is that? That's his name. His name is Barack Hussein Obama. Why should I not say it?
I mean, you could just call him President Obama.
I could call him anything I want. I'm not calling him out of his name. I'm not carrying your water. I'm not in the business of furthering your political objectives. I simply referred to the man by his name.
Yeah,
Now, if you
I
hold on, let me
fear.
finish. No, hold
Sure.
on, just a moment.
Sure, go ahead.
If you're impugning my motives by suggesting that the reason that I'm using his name, you ask me, why do I use his name? Why isn't that's his name enough? If you're impugning my motives, that's slander. You have no reason whatsoever to assume anything about my motives other than what it is that I've told you that they are, which is I'm using his name just like I would say Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And no, I'm not going out of my way to avoid using his name because there exist people who are racist. That's my response to that.
And on the first point?
These studies are out there. Of course, the resume studies you refer to Bertrand and Mulanathan, but there are others. I am not saying that there's no bias. What I'm saying is that it's a relatively insignificant component of the disparity question. Now, there are technical answers. The fact that you don't get a call back with the same frequency doesn't mean you don't find a job. It means basically it takes you longer to find a job. That's not good. That's bad. That's a cost imposed on people by discrimination. It exists. It doesn't mean that when you're hired, you're paid a lower wage than somebody else. That's a market-driven phenomenon that, you can try to measure how much people are paid and so forth. There have been studies controlling for the skills that people bring into the labor market that attempt to assess what proportion of the observed for Black men, young men, about 75 cents on a dollar compared to white men. How much of that is accounted for by the skills people bring to the market? We could go through chapter and verse, but it's 5%, 7% of the disparity is accounted for by unexplained productivity factors when they put test scores or other cognitive measures on the right-hand side of these regression equations. The testers, when they send testers around to employers and whatnot, there are disparities that are found, but they are not necessarily measures of, this is again a somewhat technical point, the actual market discrimination, because they measure the average and not the marginal dispreference for Black labor. But in any case, I don't want to get lost in the woods. My basic answer to you is yes, of course there's racial discrimination. I don't mean to say that it doesn't exist. What I mean to say is that in the year 2021, the proportion of the African-American disparity accounted for by racial discrimination is small, in the single digits, whereas in times further in the past, it would have been a much more significant factor. It's not nearly enough to account for the differences in economic status or whatever that motivates a lot of the concern about racial inequality. That would be my answer. The other economists will have a different take on the evidence.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be selfish and ask a question of my own before some of the other audience members. You talked about this before at some length in your podcast, but could you describe the implication that critical race theory has on African Americans' own agency?
Well, if by critical race theory we mean this very generic intellectual disposition that is reflected in the writings of people from Ibram X. Kendi to Ta-Nehisi Coates, to Nicole Hannah-Jones and others. We could talk about that. I don't specifically know, in the Regina Austin or Derek Bell or Patricia Williams or other legal scholars going back 30 years or so who might have been progenitors of critical race theory as it grew out of the left wing of the legal academy. I don't know what their writings. I'm not in a position to opine about what their writings have to say about agency, but I can make a couple observations about the general zeitgeist of progressive anti-racism and agency, and it's a matter of some concern to me, which I hinted at in my close. So if the argument is America has to get its knee off of our necks before we can get anything done, it's disempowering in the extreme. If the argument, as the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates would have it, the American dream is a fraud, basically the wind will always be in our face and the hounds will always be at our heels, it's disempowering. If we tell people that they need to be afraid of the police, afraid of them, because the police are basically preying on them, that's the generic condition of African-American communities, occupied territory by forces of the state that are bent on and using deadly force in order to suppress you because of your race. I think that that's not exactly a good thing to be telling people about the principal public agents on which they need to rely in order to be secure in their person and their property. So, I mean, I've written in my own stuff at length about the disempowering consequences of the belief that African Americans are basically prostrate, lying at the feet of a behemoth, who are completely dependent upon the beneficence of the behemoth to relieve them of their burdens and to secure them in their goals. They can't raise our children for us, etc. There are some things within a community that require to be done by members of the community and simply can't be done by others. And we wouldn't have it be any other way for concerns about the autonomy and the privacy of the intimate spaces in which a lot of human development takes place, where a lot of racial inequality ultimately has its roots. I speak of what happens in the family and involuntary associations of one kind or another in civil society. So, I mean, I don't know what the questioner might want from me, but those are a few of the thoughts that occur to me when you ask about agency.
It looks like Professor John Rummel wants to ask a question. You can go ahead.
Yes, this is kind of a follow-on, Mr. Loury, to your last point, and it's regarding fear and the like. I'm wondering why you think it is that most Black parents and guardians, I think conservative and liberal alike, feel it imperative to have the quote-unquote talk with their children, mostly adolescent males, concerning how to conduct themselves in encounters with police when most white parents and guardians, at least to my understanding, rarely feel compelled to have that conversation with their sons. Is that a misunderstanding about what someone should be telling their kids? Is that distracting from their children's agency? I see that. I believe what I've said to be true, but I'm interested in your opinion about my observation.
Okay, Professor Rummel. I actually don't know of any credible, survey data that chronicles and measures, the frequency of the talk. But I'll take it as a stipulation. I'm quite happy to agree. It's a very commonly encountered reference, and I'm sure many people do. I have 3 sons. I've never had, quote unquote, the talk with my sons. But if my wife, my late wife, Linda, had been around in their teen years, it wouldn't have all surprised me if she had said, we should sit down with our kids. Prudent prophylactic would be my first response. There's a real issue is my second response. I don't mean to be saying, and this is in keeping with my answer to Professor Cover, I don't mean to be saying that there's no there. It's a question of proportion. So in a city where there are problematic encounters between the police and Black people, where there are, frankly, Black lawbreakers whom the police are encountering, whom well may give the police some kind of predicate for a kind of profiling, which we know is not supposed to happen, but which I think we can't deny is a very difficult thing to control. The tendency, I see someone, he looks like someone else whom I know might have been a problem, therefore this person might be a problem, that kind of cognitive reaction. In a world in which that kind of stereotyping might be going on, it seems a prudent prophylactic to say, look, if you get pulled over, obey. In fact, I'm calling for that. My remarks call for telling people to comply. You could call that the talk. Let that be my talk. If you encounter a police officer, obey his commands. That's a full stop. There will be ample time to pursue your concerns about the illegitimacy of the way in which you were detained. Obey the police officer should you encounter him. That's my talk. But, you know, in a big city where there are issues, where there are encounters between cops and young Black men that go bad, where you could end up getting shot by accident because a guy thinks you've got a pistol in the glove compartment. So when you reach in there to get your registration without him having told you to do so, you end up getting shot. Don't let that happen to you. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. That sounds like a common sense prophylactic. I can see that people would want to do it. I don't deny that there are issues in terms of how the police encounter African Americans, but I stand by my claim that if, you know, and we could go down the list, hadn't resisted arrest, hadn't attempted to run from the police, hadn't tried to get back in the car, hadn't fought with the police, etc., they'd still be alive. So we're going to do the talk. Let's include the whole talk. And the whole talk includes, in my opinion, don't make the police officer think that he has to fight you for his gun. If you do that, you're going to end up like Michael Brown ended up. He was not assassinated. He was not murdered. Okay, so we're going to have a talk. Let's have the whole talk.
I appreciate your response. The other part of my question, though, was it doesn't seem to me that I, as a white parent or guardian, typically feel compelled to have that talk. Doesn't that suggest something about more than just a few rogue policemen? I'm suggesting, or I'd be interested in your opinion about how that plays out regarding your assessment of systemic racism.
Well, as you know, with the 1,200 or so police killings of citizens that happen each year, only about 300 of them are African American, and the majority, a substantial majority of them are whites. It may be that whites need to be telling, at least if they live in certain kinds of communities where certain kind of things are going on, their young people about how to interact with the police, because in fact, police are killing a lot of white people in the country. It may be that the white reaction is the more prudent reaction, all things considered, and that Blacks are hypersensitive to this matter. I think that has to be allowed. But the main, I don't want to get into an argument about that. I can see people having different views about that. The main point I want to make is policing is one thing, racial violence is another. And the encounters between the few score encounters, and in fact, a few dozen encounters between police and unarmed African Americans that end up in the police killing the citizen are hardly emblematic or representative of the general nature of African American existence. So if we're going to talk about policing, let's talk about policing. And I would say to white people, to the extent that you think there's a problem, you guys are catching the butt end of it. Overrepresentation statistically of Blacks, for sure, we're a quarter or so of those killed by the police, and we're a tenth or so of the population. We're also overrepresented amongst those encountering the police because of lawbreaking activity, as I pointed out. But if there's a problem with the cops, it's a problem with the cops. It's not necessarily a racial problem.
Thanks for that discussion. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Well, I can add some anecdotal stuff to that. But my uncle was a police officer, and I was given that talk, and I grew up in Canada. My wife, both of her parents are police officers, are retired now. She was given that talk. So, you know, I don't know. It might be like you said, just based on where you are or what your parents think is appropriate. To move on, there's kind of two questions from two different people that are essentially the same. Given your position, what do you think the solution is to this racial problem, to bridge this gap in development?
I don't know. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. It's a very, very hard problem. I think early childhood investments, and this is not just on a racial issue, this is about what do we do for our people in the context of a social welfare compact or a welfare state that is decent. You know, you could talk about healthcare, you could talk about human development, early childhood intervention. I'm a follower of the work of the economist James Heckman of the University of Chicago, a Nobel laureate who's been working for the last 20 years really on evaluating early intervention programs like the Perry preschool. This is a very enriched preschool. Call it daycare is an understatement of how much resources and whatnot go into the treatment. In Ypsilanti, Michigan, an experimental development that's been carried on over the last 40 years, and they followed the young people who got the benefits of this treatment through life, and they've seen cognitive gains, but they've mainly seen behavioral gains in terms of avoiding early unwed pregnancy and an early encounter with incarceration, completing school, marriage and family structure and things like that. But there's a lot of different stuff out there. There's nurse visitation of young mothers in terms of intensive public health kind of outreach to try to empower and inform mothers about the critical role that their treatment of the youngster in the earliest years of cognitive and neurological development, the dieting, the behavioral issues that are relevant to the child's development, empowering and informing mothers about that. I mean, I could give a list of, universal pre-K, I think is something that people talk about. I think it really matters. I mean, we could talk about social entrepreneurship within the African-American community to try to express the importance of parenting and of, fatherhood and things like that. We could talk about the negative cultural influence of certain strands of popular culture that are widely consumed by African Americans that may glorify or glamorize ways of life that are not entirely constructive, stuff like that. But I don't have anything novel to offer with respect to the general social policy question, which I think is a question for Americans, not just for Black Americans, about what do we do to ensure the human development of our most vulnerable and disadvantaged fellow citizens. Personally, I think that competition in the realm of public education is a desirable thing. I'm talking about charter schools. I'm talking about choice. It's very controversial politically. It's certainly not a panacea. No, all charter schools are not equal, and they're not all the best thing since sliced bread, but some of them are doing extraordinarily effective work in some very difficult circumstances. And why not let 1,000 flowers bloom? Why not give parents the agency and the option of availing themselves of alternative educational? Why not attempt to stimulate the development of entrepreneurial initiative in the realm of educational intervention? It doesn't all have to be public sector provided and so on. That's something that I think of, but I would be rambling if I continued in this vein. I do not have a panacea or a PAC program to offer you.
This other question comes in. It's a two-part question. I've heard an argument that many problems in the African American community are rooted in the disintegration of the African American family. How do you respond? And then second, do you think that the reason people are so afraid to have this conversation is because of intimidation of the conversation, and any criticisms of things like hip hop culture are responded to with charges of racial bias?
I'd answer yes and yes to that. I do think, so it's 7 in 10 babies born to a Black woman in America are born to a woman without a husband. So it's high amongst whites as well. I think 3 in 10, something like that. Used to be a lot lower. Of course, we're not the same society as we were 50 or 75 years ago. Ideas about sexuality, about the roles of women, about family have evolved and they've changed. I don't suspect or desire that we would go back to 1950. On the other hand, I can't help but think that, well, 2 parents in the household supervising the raising of children are more than 1 parent. They're 48 rather than 24 adult hours per day. They're 2 paychecks rather than 1. They are role models of male and female responsible adult behavior, which might not be bad for boys and girls coming up in family structure. I think the evidence is actually unequivocal that single parenthood is a drag on the childhood achievement. Of course, obviously, there are many single parents who do an outstanding job and many children of single parent households who succeed in life. That's obviously true. It doesn't contradict the other thing that I said. I think 7 in 10 kids, I think a community, you find this in the Raj Chetty, the economist at Harvard's comprehensive studies of social mobility across generations, who has been finding that in communities where there are high out of wedlock birth rates, high fatherlessness in the households, that youngsters are less likely to be able to advance ahead of the status that their parents had achieved. He doesn't know exactly why that's true, but it's a robust finding, and that's just one of many such investigations that I could call attention to. This is not something that you simply wave a wand or change a policy and it changes. It's very controversial to talk about what factors might be implicated in the secular trend that we're observing of increased single parenthood in the society as a whole, as well as amongst African Americans, where it has become the norm. There are arguments about the impact of the welfare state, the incentives of transfer programs, and so on, which I don't want to engage here. There are arguments on both sides of that question. I simply call attention to the fact that it's a matter of some debate. So yes, I think family structure is important. And as I said in my talk, I think the relative disorganization and instability in African-American family structure is a part of the story about why we have the disparities that we have, both in the criminal justice system and more broadly in the society. The other part of the question is, are people afraid to talk about this and other related matters because they don't want to endure the social opprobrium attendant to being identified as someone willing to take up these matters? The answer to that is, I think, yes, without equivocation. I think there can be no doubt about it. I think that I would already be canceled if I were a white professor. If I were a white professor who said what I said here, which is that here's the real problem 1/5 of the way into the 21st century. We basically have equality, not perfectly, but basically, of opportunity in this rich, dynamic society. And Blacks are not measuring up to our end of the deal. On the whole, not every person to be sure, but on the average, we're not carrying our part of the deal. Basically, America is an open society with equal rights for all members of the society. Not perfectly so, but basically so. And we're not carrying our end of the deal. Look at the incarceration rate, look at the school failure rate, look at the out of wedlock birth rate, et cetera. I'd be done. I'd be finished. Game over. Unemployable. I'd be a cartoon. I'd be a poster. I'd be a dartboard if I said that and I were white. So I'm not white. I could be wrong about it. As I said, they're going to call me names. I'm going to get labeled. I'm going to become an abettor of the birther movement or whatever. And I can live with that.
Professor McFarland says that this characterization of Black families has its root in the Moynihan Report, written in 1965, and has been debunked countless times in the decades since it was written. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't accept that that's true. I would call your attention to James Patterson, the historian, the American historian's book about Moynihan in the Moynihan Report. I forget what he calls it exactly, but it wouldn't be hard to find. James Patterson. I don't think the Moynihan Report has been debunked. I mean, Moynihan, I mean, he was not Moynihan was not William Julius Wilson, the distinguished sociologist. Moynihan was not James S. Coleman, the distinguished sociologist. Moynihan was basically a political operative, intellectually, had a PhD, but he was not a deep social scientist. So if you're saying Moynihan report doesn't survive the scrutiny of the referees at the American Journal of Sociology, I'd say fine. But what did Moynihan say? He said, in my mind, two things. One was a description, high rate of out-of-wedlock birth amongst African Americans. And that was true. When he wrote, it was about 25% of children born to a Black woman were born to a woman without a husband, but that was up from like 10% within a quarter century. And he chronicled this dramatic rise, and he said this is a fact, and he thought it was a problem. The other thing he said was, it's going to end up getting in the way of us achieving the goals of the Great Society with respect to racial equality. I think that that was actually borne out. I think that has actually been borne out by history. Now, Moynihan was accused of blaming the victim. He was accused in effect of what I was accused of not long ago, which is talking about something which might be factually correct, but talking about it in ways that were not sufficiently respectful of the sensibilities of people. He was accused of blaming the victim. He introduced this idea, he didn't introduce it into his report, he introduced it, that I associate with E. Franklin Frazier, the distinguished African-American sociologist, about the so-called matrilineal, the matro-dominant, woman-dominated family dynamic as opposed to male-dominated. And of course, in the era of feminism and post-feminism, such a lens of looking at the family is going to fall under sharp academic criticism, and deservedly so, deservedly so. But the main facts of the Moynihan Report, 1965, a case for national action was the subtitle of his report, The Negro Family, a Case for National Action. He wanted to put on more shifts at the post office to encourage the employment prospects of African-American men, so as in the hope that this would solidify the family. Again, I know that doesn't pass the smell test in the year 2021 in our enlightened post-feminist sensibility, but as a man of his time, it was a relatively progressive posture. And so he said two things. He said, this is something that's going on, and this is going to be a problem. And I don't think that he's been, quote unquote, debunked by history with respect to either of those.
This is a bit of a longer question from Professor Newton. It seems you want to avoid the complexity and evidence supporting the racial disparities, particularly in criminal justice. I'm hearing a lot of anecdotes and ideological positions. Do you have evidence-based justifications for your positions? In other words, can you demonstrate the lack of racial disparities and the lack of racial motivations to counter the voluminous research supporting these conclusions? For example, Black men account for 15% of drug users, 27% of arrests, 31% of those sentenced to state prison, and 38% of those sent to federal prison. How do you account for escalating disparities? If you have communities of color where virtually 1 in 3 men is in custody or in supervision, then it's hard for these communities to dig out. People with felony drug convictions have a hard time getting jobs and stabilizing. In short, the research is voluminous, and I'm not hearing research in response.
Well, I'm not a criminologist. I did serve on the National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences committee that was chaired by Jeremy Travis. Jeremy Travis is a criminologist and former president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York, a former, I think, assistant attorney general in charge of the research shop inside the Justice Department during one of the previous presidential administrations. But Jeremy Travis, you can look him up. He's a very distinguished, and Bruce Western was the co-chair. Bruce Western is a professor at Columbia now, had been at Princeton. Before that, he was been at Harvard. He's a friend of mine. The Committee on Law and Justice of the National Academy of Sciences. I've been a member for many years. James Q. Wilson, the late great political scientist, criminologist, a good friend of mine. I've collaborated with him, et cetera. I'm not a criminologist, but I do know something about this literature. No, I didn't present chapter and verse, but I would refer you to the report of the Committee on the Causes and Consequences of High Rates of Incarceration in the United States, National Academy of Science, Causes and Consequences of High Rates of Incarceration in the United States. The report was issued like 2015 or so. I served on that panel that put that report together. And we address in there Al Bloomstein, the senior criminologist at Carnegie Mellon, one of the empiricists who's tried to measure the extent to which the disparities which exist. There are no doubt that there are racial disparities in the criminal justice system. The question is whether they're accounted for by law breaking. The extent to which sentences are longer, conditional on the same offense. The extent to which the likelihood of being convicted of the offense is higher, conditional on the same evidence. That kind of bias. Disparity is not bias. The fact that Blacks are overrepresented amongst those in trouble with the law is not ipso facto evidence of bias. Unless you define bias to be disparity, it could also be evidence of differences in behavior as between the communities. Now, I would take the critique further, the critique implied by the question. The critique implied by the question is basically you've misrepresented the reality, Loury, by downplaying discrimination. To which my response is, no, I haven't. The evidence bears me out. There are disparities, but they cannot be demonstrated to be the consequence of racial bias. The counterfactual, if they had been white, they wouldn't have been incarcerated, I don't think can be shown to be true. But we can have an argument about that. We could go to the research paper, but I don't accept the characterization. But there's a deeper critique in the same spirit, which is that if you're going to have laws against narcotics trafficking, who could be surprised that the people who participate in the low-end retail part of that trade, who take on the risk, the enormous risk associated with engaging in such activity, or will be disproportionately drawn from those at the bottom of society? Of course, those are the people whose alternative legal and legitimate economic options are scant. They don't have skills that are valued in the marketplace, or they don't have the opportunity to sell them. And therefore, they're going to be disproportionately represented amongst the workforce of the Black traffic. Now, if you decide that you're going to make that a punitive response, because I would prefer to think of dependence on narcotics as a health problem, not as a moral problem against which the apparatus of the law needs to be brought to bear, but that would just be me. If you're going to make it into a punitive problem, and you're going to moreover design your enforcement regime so that it focuses on retail trafficking, and you have your cops out sweeping up kids who are on the corners slinging these rocks, then you're going to end up with an overrepresentation of African Americans amongst those who are going to be hit by this punitive regime, because they are disproportionately amongst those who will find it in their interest to elect to participate in the illegal trade. But mind you, the problem did not come from them. The problem came from the demand side of the narcotics trafficking, which is very ecumenical in terms of race and class. It's people waving $100 bills out of the windows of their late model vehicles for these kids to be out there on the corner in the first place. But we're not making them the site of our crusade against the antisocial behavior. We're making the kid who's on the supply side of that transaction the site. And that has got a racially disparate incidence for the reasons that I just suggested. And you could call that systemic racism if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be the kind of thing that would be detectable by a committee of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at arrest data, court processing data, sentencing data, and came to the conclusion, contra Michelle Alexander, that it's not the new Jim Crow that accounts for the overrepresentation of Blacks in prison. It is the overrepresentation of Blacks amongst people duly convicted of lawbreaking that accounts for our overrepresentation in prison. We could move the goalposts and talk about the law itself. Why is it such as it is? Why has it not changed in light of the fact that it has this disproportionate incidence? And I think that that could be a fruitful conversation, but that's my response.
Professor Loury, I don't want to keep you longer than you want to be here for, but I'm happy to keep asking questions. I'll leave it to you if you want.
Why don't we take one more question? I had allowed an hour for this activity. We're at 75 minutes if my clock is accurate.
All right. Statistics have shown that Black men are roughed up more often by police and incarcerated for longer terms than their Caucasian counterparts. How would you explain this? And how would you suggest this be fixed? And this is prefaced by that she doesn't believe police brutality is a race issue. It applies to and affects all races. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is the only current way to have a change in police brutality. Is this a fair assessment?
Okay. Um, I am not aware of the evidence that Blacks receive longer sentences for the same offense, but I am happy to be educated about that. I just spoke to my experience with that National Research Council committee. That's not what we found by and large. I'm not aware of that. Um, but roughed up, I am aware. Roland Fryer, the economist at Harvard, whose study of data in Houston, establishing in those data that African Americans were not more susceptible to officer-involved shooting during an arrest once you controlled for the conditions of the arrest than were whites. He found that. But he also found that various uses of force short of deadly force, cuffing people, forcing them to the ground, roughing them up, and so on, the use of taser and so on, was statistically more frequent, other things controlled for, when the suspect was African American. And that's a fact. I don't know how to account for that beyond simply saying there's bias in the evident bias in the frequency with which police repair to force short of deadly force when they're dealing with people in custody. Why that is, I mean, we could go into it. I don't know. I would find plausible the assertion that there's something about the racial identity of the suspect and the police officer, which induces the police officer to respond differently. It could be implicit bias. It could be overt racism. I certainly am not here standing here telling you that there's no such thing as overt racism. But again, that's going to be my answer to that question if you ask me why. I'm sorry, I forgot the last part. Oh, Black Lives Matter. Okay, we'll see. We'll see. I think the statute that's in Congress now for police accountability that would get rid of qualified immunity, bar the chokehold, bar the no-knock warrants, and impose a duty of intervention on bystander police officers if they see abuse taking place by one of their fellows. I would not deny that the existence of such a piece of legislation is partly the fruit of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think you've got a lot of justice DAs who've been elected in jurisdictions around the country explicitly on the platform of decarceration, decriminalization. Their political fortunes too, I think, have been abetted by this general concern about Blacks and policing that the Black Lives Matter movement have fostered. I don't think the jury is in either on the effectiveness of these measures or on the long-term political implications of the Black Lives Matter movement. If Trump had won this election, he didn't. I'm not confused about that. He didn't win the election, he lost the election. But if he had won it, it was closer, it was a lot closer than people I think want to credit. It may well, I think, have gone down into the history books in part as a fruit of the summer of 2020, and that would have not been a good thing from the point of view of a whole lot of people concerned about the interests of African Americans. That's a hypothetical that didn't come to pass. I gave my own view about what I think backlash can look like in this country and how I think it can be politically counterproductive. I think Black Lives Matter has contributed to that as well. This is not your grandfather's civil rights movement. This is not Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson being somehow reconciled in the 20th century by Martin Luther King Jr. in a magnificent promissory note. This is not going down iconically into the lure of the country with a monument on the Washington Mall, at least not yet. At least not yet. So I think, we're just going to have to see what it all comes to at the end of the day.
Well, thank you so much for accepting the invitation, Professor Loury. I can't thank you enough. I was pleasantly shocked that you said yes, and I've enjoyed this session. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I don't want people to think I'm hiding from robust engagement on these controversial questions. I welcome the opportunity and I appreciate the vigor with which I was challenged here, and apologize if I overstepped in my vigorous defense of my own positions. But I'm glad to have done it, and I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.